with little rocky coves from one to another of which we had to ride through rolling surf beneath the welcome shade of low shrub-fringed cliffs, while over the little mangrove swamp at the mouth of the glen, Tokouche rose sheer, like McGillicuddy's reeks transfigured into one huge emerald. We turned inland again and stopped for luncheon at a clear brook running through a grove of cacao and bois immortels. We sat beneath the shade of a huge bamboo clump, cut ourselves pint stoops out of the joints, and then, like great boys, got, some of us at least, very wet in fruitless attempts to catch a huge crayfish, nigh 18 inches long, blue and grey, and of a shape something between a gnat and a spider, who, with a wife and child, had taken up his abode in a pool among the spurs of a great bois immortel. However, he was too nimble for us, and we went on, and inland once more, luckily not leaving our bamboo stoops behind. We descended, I remember, to the seashore again, at a certain Maracas Bay, and had a long ride along bright sands, between surf and scrub, in which ride, by the by, the civilizer of Montserrat and I, to avoid the blinding glare of the sand, rode along the firm sand between the sea and the lagoon, through the low wood of shore grape and mahout, penguin and swamp seguin, which last is an arum with a knotted stem from 3 to 12 feet high. We brushed our way along with our cutlasses as we sat on our saddles enjoying the cool shade, till my companion's mule found herself jammed tight in a scrub, and unable to forge either ahead or astern. Her rider was jammed too, and unable to get off, and the two had to be cut out of the bush by fair hewing, amid much laughter, while the wise old mule, as the cutlasses flashed close to her nose, never moved a muscle, perfectly well aware of what had happened, and how she was to be got out of the scrape, as she had been probably 50 times before. We stopped at the end of the long beach, thoroughly tired and hungry, for we had been on the march many hours, and discovered for the first time that we had nothing left to eat. Luckily, a certain little pot of ramone, essence of soup, was recollected and brought out. The kettle was boiling in 5 minutes, and half a teaspoonful per man of the essence put on a knife's point, and stirred with a cutlass, to the astonishment of the grinning and unbelieving negroes, who were told that we were going to make obeah soup, and were more than half of that opinion themselves. Meanwhile, I saw the wise mule led up into the bush, and on asking its owner why, was told that she was to be fed, on what I could not see, but, much to my amusement, he cut down a quantity of the young leaves of the cocorite palm, and she began to eat them greedily, as did my police horse. And, when the bamboo stoops were brought out, and 3/4 of a pint of good soup was served round, not forgetting the negroes, one of whom, after sucking it down, rubbed his stomach, and declared with a grin that it was very good obeah, the oddness of the scene came over me. The blazing beach, the misty mountains, the hot trade wind, the fantastic leaves overhead, the black limbs and faces, the horses eating palm leaves, and we sitting on logs among the strange, ungainly Montricardias, drinking ramone out of bamboo, washing it down with milk from green coconuts. Was this, too, a scene in a pantomime? Would it, too, vanish if one only shut one's eyes and shook one's head? We turned up into the loveliest green trace where, I know not how, the mountain vegetation had, some of it, come down to the sea level. Nowhere did I see the melastomas more luxuriant, and among them, arching over our heads like parasols of green lace, between us and the sky, were tall tree ferns as fine as those on the mountain slopes. In front of us opened a flat meadow of a few acres, and beyond it, spur upon spur, rose a noble mountain, in so steep a wall that it was difficult to see how we were to ascend. Ere we got to the mountain foot, some of our party had nigh come to grief, for across the Savannah wandered a deep lagoon brook. The only bridge had been washed away by rains, and we had to get the horses through as we could, all but swimming them, 2 men on each horse, and then to drive the poor creatures back for a fresh double load, with fallings, splashings, much laughter, and a qualm or two at the recollection that there might be unpleasant animals in the water. Electric eels, happily, were not invented at the time when Trinidad parted from the main, or at least had not spread so far east. But alligators had been by that time fully developed, and had arrived here in plenty, and to be laid hold of by one would have been undesirable, though our party was strong enough to have made very short work with the monster. So over we got, and through much mud and up mountains some 1,500 feet high, on which the vegetation was even richer than we had seen before, and down the other side with the great lowland of the Gulf of Paria opening before us. We rested at a police station, always a pleasant sight in Trinidad, for the sake of the stalwart, soldier-like brown policemen and their buxom wives, and neat houses and gardens, a focus of discipline and civilization amid what would otherwise relapse too soon into anarchy and barbarism. We whiled away the time by inspecting the ward police reports, which were kept as neatly and worded as well as they would have been in England, and then rolled comfortably in the carriage down to Port of Spain, tired and happy, after 3 such days as had made old blood and old brains young again. Chapter 12. The Savannah of Repo. The last of my pleasant rides, and one which would have been perhaps the pleasantest of all, had I had, as on other occasions, the company of my host, was to the cocoa or cocoa palm grove of the east coast, taking on my way the Savannah of Repo. It had been our wish to go up the Orinoco as far as Ciudad Bolivar, the Angostura of Humboldt's travels, to see the new capital of southern Venezuela, fast rising into wealth and importance under the wise and pacific policy of its president, Senor Dalla Costa, a man said to possess a genius and an integrity far superior to the average South American Republicans, of which latter the less said the better, to push back, if possible, across those llanos which Humboldt describes in his Personal Narratives, Volume 4, page 295. It may be to visit the Falls of the Caroni, but that had to be done by others after we were gone. My days in the island were growing short, and the most I could do was to see at Repo a small specimen of that peculiar savanna vegetation which occupies thousands of square miles on the mainland. If, therefore, the reader cares nothing for botanical and geological speculations, he will be wise to skip this chapter. But those who are interested in the vast changes of level and distribution of land which have taken place all over the world since the present forms of animals and vegetables were established on it, may possibly find a valuable fact or two in what I thought I saw at the Savannah of Repo. My first point was, of course, the little city of San Josef, to an Englishman the place will be always interesting as the scene of Raleigh's exploit and the capture of Boreas, and, to one who has received the kindness which I have received from the Spanish gentlemen of the neighbourhood, a spot full of most grateful memories. It lies pleasantly enough on a rise at the southern foot of the mountains, and at the mouth of a torrent which comes down from the famous Chorro, or waterfall of Maracas. In going up to that waterfall, just at the back of the town, I found buried in several feet of earth a great number of seemingly recent but very ancient shells. Whether they be remnants of an elevated sea beach or some Indian kitchen midden, I dare not decide, but the question is well worth the attention of any geologist who may go that way. The waterfall and the road up to it are best described by one who, after 14 years of hard scientific work in the island, now lies lonely in San Fernando churchyard, far from his beloved fatherland. He, or at least all of him that could die. I wonder whether that of him which can never die knows what his fatherland is doing now. But to the waterfall of Maracas, or rather to poor Dr. Kruger's description of it. The northern chain of mountains, covered nearly everywhere with dense forests, is intersected at various angles by numbers of valleys presenting the most lovely character. Generally, each valley is watered by a silvery stream, tumbling here and there over rocks and natural dams, ministering in a continuous rain to the strange-looking river canes, dumb canes and balisiers that voluptuously bend their heads, to the drizzly shower which plays incessantly on the glistening leaves, off which the globules roll in 1,000 pearls, as from the glossy plumage of a stately swan. One of these falls deserves particular notice, the Cascade of Maracas, in the valley of that name. The high road leads up the valley a few miles, over hills and along the windings of the river, exhibiting the varying scenery of our mountain district in the fairest style. There, on the riverside, you may admire the gigantic pepper trees, or the silvery leaves of the calathea, the lofty bamboo or the fragrant pothos, the curious cyclanthus or frowning nettles, some of the latter from 10 to 12 feet high. But how to describe the numberless treasures which everywhere strike the eye of the wandering naturalist? To reach the Chorro or cascade, you strike to the right into a path that brings you first to a cacao plantation, through a few rice or maize fields, and then you enter the shade of the virgin forest. Thousands of interesting objects now attract your attention. Here, the wonderful Norantia, or the resplendent Calicophyllum, a Tabernae montana, or a Faramea, filling the air afar off with the fragrance of their blossoms. There, a graceful Heliconia, winking at you from out some dark ravine. That shrubbery above is composed of a species of Boemeria or Ardisia, and that scarlet flower belongs to our native Aphelandra. In the rear are one or two philodendrons, disagreeable guests, for their smell is bad enough, and they blister when imprudently touched. There also you may see a tree fern, though a small one. Nearer to us and low down beneath our feet, that rich panicle of flowers belongs to a begonia, and here also is an assemblage of ferns of the genera Asplenium, Hymenophyllum, and Trichomones, as well as of Hepaticae and mosses. But what are those yellow and purple flowers hanging above our heads? They are bignonias and muncanas, creepers straying from afar, which have selected this spot where they may, under the influence of the sun's beams, propagate their race. Those chain-like, fantastic, strange-looking lianes, resembling a family of boas or bauhinias, and beyond, through the opening you see, in the abandoned ground of some squatter's garden, the trumpet tree, Cecropia, and the gru-gru, the characteristic plants of the rastrillo. Now let us proceed on our walk. We mean the cascade. Here it is, opposite to you, a grand spectacle indeed. From a perpendicular wall of solid rock of more than 300 feet, down rushes a stream of water, splitting in the air and producing a constant shower, which renders this lovely spot singularly and deliciously cool. Nearly the whole extent of this natural wall is covered with plants, among which you can easily discern numbers of ferns and mosses, 2 species of pitcairnea, with beautiful red flowers, some aroids, various nettles, and here and there a begonia. How different such a spot would look in cold Europe! Below, in the midst of a never-failing drizzle, grow luxuriant ardisias, aroids, ferns, costas, heliconias, centropogons, hydrocotyles, cyperoids, and grasses of various genera, tradescantias and comelinas, bilbergias, and occasionally a few small rubiaceae and melastomaceae. The cascade, when I saw it, was somewhat disfigured above and below. Above, the forest fires of last year had swept the edge of the cliff and had even crawled halfway down, leaving blackened rocks and grey stems. And below, loyal zeal had cut away only too much of the rich vegetation to make a shed or stable in anticipation of a visit from the Duke of Edinburgh, who did not come. A year or two, however, in this climate will heal these temporary scars, and all will be as luxuriant as ever. Indeed, such scars heal only too fast here, for the paths become impassable from brush and weeds every 6 months, and have to be cutlassed out afresh. And when it was known that we were going up to the waterfall, a gang had to be set to work to save the lady of the party being wetted through by leaf dew up to her shoulders, as she sat upon her horse. Pretty it was, a bit out of an older and more simple world, to see the yeoman gentleman who had contracted for the mending of the road, and who counts among his ancestors the famous Ponce de Leon, meeting us halfway on our return, dressed more simply and probably much poorer than an average English yeoman, but keeping untainted and stately Castilian courtesy, as with his hat in hand, I hope I need not say that my hat was at my saddle-bow all the while, he inquired whether La Señorita had found the path free from all obstructions, and so forth. The old order changes, giving place to the new, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. But when, 200 years hence, there are no more such gentlemen of the old school left in the world, what higher form of true civilization shall we have invented to put in its place? None as yet. All our best civilization, in every class, is derived from the true self-respect which is founded on respect for others. From San Josef I was taken on in the carriages of a Spanish gentleman through Arima, a large village where an Indian colony makes those baskets and other wares from the aruma leaf for which Trinidad is noted, and on to his estate at Guanapo, a pleasant lowland place with wide plantations of cacao, only 14 years old but in full and most profitable bearing, rich meadows with huge clumps of bamboo, and a roomy timber house, beautifully thatched with palm, which serves as a retreat in the dry season for him and his ladies when baked out of dusty San Josef. On my way there, by the by, I espied and gathered for the first and last time a flower very dear to me, a crimson passion flower, rambling wild over the bush. When we arrived, the sun was still so high in heaven that the kind owner offered to push on that very afternoon to the Savannah of a Repo some 5 miles off. Police horses had arrived from Arima, in one of which I recognized my trusty old brown cob of the northern mountains, and laid hands on him at once, and away 3 or 4 of us went, the squire leading the way on his mule, with cutlass and umbrella both needful enough. We went along a sandy high road bordered by a vegetation new to me, low trees with wiry branches and shining evergreen leaves, which belonged, I was told, principally to the myrtle tribe, were overtopped by jaguar palms and packed below with penguins, with the wild pineapples whose rose and purple flower heads were very beautiful, and with a species of palm of which I had often heard, but which I had never seen before, at least in any abundance, namely the timit, the leaves of which are used as thatch. A low tree, seldom rising more than 20 or 30 feet, it throws out wedge-shaped leaves, some 10 or 12 feet long, sometimes all but entire, sometimes irregularly pinnate, because the space between the straight and parallel side nerves has not been filled up. These flat wedge-shaped sheets, often 6 feet across, and the oblong pinnae, some 3 feet long by 6 inches to a foot in breadth, make admirable thatch, and on emergency, as we often saw that day, good umbrellas. Bundles of them lay along the roadsides, tied up, ready for carrying away, and each negro or negress whom we passed carried a timit leaf and hooked it on to his head when a gush of rain came down. After a while we turned off the high road into a forest path, which was sound enough, the soil being one sheet of poor sand and white quartz gravel, which would in Scotland or even Devonshire have carried nothing taller than heath, but was here covered with impenetrable jungle. The luxuriance of this jungle, be it remembered, must not delude a stranger, as it has too many ere now, into fancying that the land would be profitable under cultivation. As long as the soil is shaded and kept damp, it will bear an abundant crop of woody fibre which, composed almost entirely of carbon and water, drains hardly any mineral constituents from the soil. But if that jungle be once cleared off, the slow and careful work of ages has been undone in a moment. The burning sun bakes up everything, and the soil, having no mineral staple wherewith to support a fresh crop if planted, is reduced to aridity and sterility for years to come. Timber, therefore, I believe, and timber only, is the proper crop for these poor soils, unless medicinal or otherwise useful trees should be discovered hereafter worth the planting. To thin out the useless timbers, but cautiously for fear of letting in the sun's rays, and to replace them by young plants of useful timbers, is all that government can do with the poorer bits of these crown lands, beyond protecting, as it does now to the best of its power, the natural crop of timit leaves from waste and destruction. So much it ought to do, and so much it can and will do in Trinidad, which, happily for it, possesses a government which governs, instead of leaving every man, as in the Irishman's paradise, to do what is right in the sight of his own eyes, and what is wrong too, as he likes. Without such wise regulation and even restraint of the ignorant greediness of human toil, intent only, as in the too exclusive cultivation of sugar-cane and of the cotton plant, on present profits, without foresight or care for the future, the lands of warmer climates will surely fall under the curse so well described by the venerable Elias Fries of Lund. A broad belt of waste land follows gradually in the steps of cultivation. If it expands, its centre and its cradle dies, and on the outer borders only do we find green shoots. But it is not impossible, only difficult, for man, without renouncing the advantage of culture itself, one day to make reparation for the injury which he has inflicted. He is the appointed lord of creation. True it is that thorns and thistles, ill-favoured and poisonous plants well named by botanists, rubbish plants, mark the track which man has proudly traversed through the earth. Before him lay original nature in her wild but sublime beauty. Behind him he leaves the desert, a deformed and ruined land, for childish desire of destruction or thoughtless squandering of vegetable treasures has destroyed the character of nature, and, terrified, man himself flies from the arena of his actions, leaving the impoverished earth to barbarous races or to animals, so long as yet another spot in virgin beauty smiles before him. Here again, in selfish pursuit of profit, and consciously or unconsciously following the abominable principle of the great moral vileness which one man has expressed, après nous le déluge, he begins anew the work of destruction. Thus did cultivation, driven out, leave the east, and perhaps the deserts formerly robbed of their coverings. Like the wild hordes of old over beautiful Greece, thus rolls the conquest with fearful rapidity from east to west through America, and the planter now often leaves the already exhausted land. The eastern climate becomes infertile through the demolition of the forests to introduce a similar revolution into the far west. For a couple of miles or more we trotted on through this jungle, till suddenly we saw light ahead, and in 5 minutes the forest ended, and a scene opened before us which made me understand the admiration which Humboldt and other travellers have expressed at the far vaster savannas of the Orinoco. A large sheet of grey-green grass bordered by the forest wall as far as the eye could see, and dotted with low bushes weltered in mirage, while stretching out into it, some half a mile off, a grey promontory into a green sea, was an object which filled me with more awe and admiration than anything which I had seen in the island. It was a wood of Maurice palms, like a Greek temple, many 100 yards in length, and, as I guessed, nearly 100 feet in height, and, like a Greek temple, ending abruptly at its full height. The grey columns, perfectly straight and parallel, supported a dark roof of leaves, grey underneath and reflecting above, from their broad fans, sheets of pale glittering light. Such serenity of grandeur I never saw in any group of trees, and when we rode up to it, and tethered our horses in its shade, it seemed to me almost irreverent not to kneel and worship in that temple not made with hands. When we had gazed our fill, we set hastily to work to collect plants, as many as the lateness of the hour and the scalding heat would allow. A glance showed the truth of Dr. Kruger's words. It is impossible to describe the feelings of the botanist when arriving at a field like this, so much unlike anything he has seen before. Here are full-blowing large orchids with red, white and yellow flowers, and among the grasses smaller ones of great variety and as great scientific interest. Melastomaceous plants of various genera, utricularias, droseras, rare and various grasses and cyperoids of small sizes and fine kinds, with a species of cassitha, in the water Ceratophyllum, and well-known hornwort of the English ponds, and bog mosses. Such a variety of forms and colours is nowhere else to be met with in the island. Of the orchids, we only found one in flower, and of the rest, of course, we had time only to gather a very few of the more remarkable, among which was that lovely cousin of the clerodendrons, the crimson Amasonia, which ought to be in all hothouses. The low bushes I found were that curious tree, the chaparro, but not the chaparro so often mentioned by Humboldt as abounding in the Llanos. This chaparro is remarkable, first for the queer little natural order to which it belongs, secondly for its tanning properties, thirdly for the very nasty smell of its flowers, fourthly for the roughness of its leaves, which makes one's flesh creep, and are used, I believe, for polishing steel, and lastly for its wide geographical range from Isla de Pinos, near Cuba, where Columbus, to his surprise, saw true pines growing in the tropics, all over the Llanos, and down to Brazil, an ancient, ugly, sturdy form of vegetation, able to get a scanty living out of the poorest soils, and consequently triumphant, as yet, in the battle of life. The soil of the Savannah was a poor sandy clay, treacherous and often impassable for horses, being half dried above the wet beneath. The vegetation grew not over the whole, but in innumerable tussocks which made walking very difficult. The type of the rushes and grasses was very English, but among them grew here and there plants which excited my astonishment, above all certain bladderworts, which I had expected to find, but which, when found, were so utterly unlike any English ones that I did not recognize at first what they were. Our English bladderworts, as everybody knows, float in stagnant water on tangles of hair-like leaves, something like those old water ranunculus, but furnished with innumerable tiny bladders, and this raft supports the little scape of yellow snapdragon-like flowers. There are in Trinidad and other parts of South America bladderworts of this type, but those which we found today, growing out of the damp clay, were more like in habit to a delicate stalk of flax or even a bent of grass, upright, leafless or all but leafless, with heads of small blue or yellow flowers, and carrying in one species a few very minute bladders about the roots, in another none at all. A strange variation from the normal type of the family, yet not so strange after all as that of another variety in the high mountain woods, which, finding neither ponds to float in nor swamp to root in, has taken to lodging as a parasite among the wet moss on tree trunks, not so strange either as that of yet another which floats, but in the most unexpected spots, namely in the water which lodges between the leaf sheaths of the wild pines, perched on the tree boughs, a parasite on parasites, and sends out long runners, as it grows, along the bough in search of the next wild pine and its tiny reservoirs. In the face of such strange facts, it is very absurd to guess that these utricularias, so like each other in their singular and highly specialized flowers, so unlike each other in the habit of the rest of the plant, have started from some one original type, perhaps long since extinct, and that, carried by birds into quite new situations, they have adapted themselves by natural selection to new circumstances, changing the parts which required change, the leaves and stalks, but keeping comparatively unchanged those which needed no change, the flowers. But I was not prepared as I should have been had I studied my Griesbach's West Indian flora carefully enough beforehand. For the next proof of the wide distribution of water plants, for as I scratched and stumbled among the tussocks, larding the lean earth as I stalked along, my kind guide put into my hand, with something of an air of triumph, a little plant which was, there is no denying it, none other than the long-leaved sundew, with its clammy-haired paws full of dead flies, just as they would have been in any bog in Devonshire or in Hampshire, in Wales or in Scotland. But how came it here? And more, how has it spread not only over the whole of Northern Europe, Canada and the United States, but even as far south as Brazil? Its being common to North America and Europe is not surprising. It may belong to that comparatively ancient flora which existed when there was landway between the two continents by way of Greenland, and the bison ranged from Russia to the Rocky Mountains. But its presence within the tropics is more probably explained by supposing that it, like the bladderworts, has been carried on the feet or in the crop of birds. The Savannah itself, like those of Coroni and Piarco, offers, I suspect, a fresh proof that a branch of the Orinoco once ran along the foot of the northern mountains of Trinidad. It is impossible, says Humboldt, to cross the burning plains of the Orinoquan savannas without inquiring whether they have always been in the same state, or whether they have been stripped of their vegetation by some revolution of nature. The stratum of mould now found on them is very thin. The plains were, doubtless, less bare in the 15th century than they are now. Yet the first conquistadores who came from Coro described them then as savannas, where nothing could be perceived save the sky and the turf, which were generally destitute of trees, and difficult to traverse on account of the reverberation of heat from the soil. Why does not the great forest of the Orinoco extend to the north or the left bank of that river? Why does not it fill that vast space that reaches as far as the Cordillera of the coast, and which is fertilized by various rivers? This question is connected with all that relates to the history of our planet. If, indulging in geological reveries, we suppose that the steppes of America and the desert of Sahara have been stripped of their vegetation by an eruption of the ocean, or that they formed the bottom of an inland lake, the Sahara, as is now well known, is the quite recently elevated bed of a great sea continuous with the Atlantic. We may conceive that thousands of years have not sufficed for the trees and shrubs to advance toward the centre from the borders of the forests, from the skirts of the plains either naked or covered with turf, and darken so vast a space with their shade. It is more difficult to explain the origin of bare savannas enclosed in forests than to recognize the causes which maintain forests and savannas within their ancient limits, like continents and seas. With these words in my mind, I could not but look on the Savannah of Repo as one of the last made bits of dry land in Trinidad, still unfurnished with the common vegetation of the island. The two invading armies of tropical plants, one advancing from the north off the now almost destroyed land which connected Trinidad and the Cordillera with the Antilles, the other from the southwest, off the utterly destroyed land which connected Trinidad with Guyana, met, as I fancy, ages since on the opposite banks of a mighty river or estuary, by which the Orinoco entered the ocean along the foot of the northern mountains. As that riverbed rose and became dry land, the two floras crossed and intermingled. Only here and there, as at a Repo, are left patches, as it were, of a third flora, which once spread uninterruptedly along the southern base of the Cordillera and over the lowland which is now the Gulf of Paria, along the alluvial flats of the mighty stream, and the Maurice palms of Repo may be the lineal descendants of those which now inhabit the Llanos of the main, as those again may be the lineal descendants of the Maurices which Schomburgk found forming forests among the mountains of Guyana, up to 4,000 feet above the sea. Age after age the Maurice apples floated down the stream, settling themselves on every damp spot not yet occupied by the richer vegetation of the forests, and ennobled with their solitary grandeur what without them would have been a dreary waste of muddy sand. These savannas of Trinidad stand, it must be remembered, in the very line where, on such a theory, they might be expected to stand, along the newest deposit, the great band of sand gravel and clay rubbish which stretches across the island at the mountain foot, its highest point in 36 miles being only 220 feet, an elevation far less than the corresponding depression of the Bocas, which has parted Trinidad from the main Cordillera. That the rubbish on this line was deposited by a river or estuary is as clear to me as that the river was either a very rapid one or subject to violent and lofty floods, as the Orinoco is now. For so are best explained not merely the sheets of gravel, but the huge piles of boulders which have accumulated at the mouth of the mountain gorges on the northern side. As for the southern shore of this supposed channel of the Orinoco, it at once catches the eye of anyone standing on the northern range. He must see that he is on one shore of a vast channel, the other shore of which is formed by the Montserrat, Tamana, and Manzanilla hills, far lower now than the northern range, Tamana only being over 1,000 feet, but doubtless in past ages far higher than now. No one can doubt this who has seen the extraordinary degradation going on still about the summits, or who remembers that the strata, whether tertiary or lower chalk, have been over the greater part of the island upheaved, faulted, set on end by the convulsions seemingly so common during the Miocene epoch, and since then sawn away by water and air into one rolling outline, quite independent of the dip of the strata. The whole southern 2/3 of Trinidad represent a wear and tear which is not to be counted by thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, and yet which, I verily believe, has taken place since the average plants, trees, and animals of the island dwelt therein. This elevation may have well coincided with the depression of the neighbouring Gulf of Paria. That the southern portion of that gulf was once dry land, that the serpent's mouth did not exist when the present varieties of plants and animals were created, is matter of fact, proven by the identity of the majority of plants and animals on both shores. How else, to give a few instances out of hundreds, did the mora, the Brazil nut, the cannonball tree, how else did the anteater, the coendu, The two cuencos, the Guatsupita deer, enter Trinidad. Humboldt, though unfortunately he never visited the island, saw this at a glance, while he perceived that the Indian story, how the Boca Drago to the north had been only lately broken through, had a foundation of truth. It cannot be doubted, he says, that the Gulf of Paria was once an inland basin, and the Punta Icaque, its southwestern extremity, united to the Punta Tolito east of the Boca de Pedernales, in which case there may well have been, one may almost say there must have been, an outlet for that vast body of water which pours, often in tremendous floods, from the Pedernales mouth of the Orinoco, as well as from those of the Tigre, Guanipa, Caroli, and other streams between it and the Cordillera on the north, and this outlet probably lay along the line now occupied by the northern savannas of Trinidad. So much this little natural park of a Repo taught, or seemed to teach me, but I did not learn the whole of the lesson that afternoon, or indeed till long after. There was no time then to work out such theories. The sun was getting low, and more intolerable as he sank, and to escape a sunstroke on the spot, or at least a dark ride home, we hurried off into the forest shade, after one last look at the never-to-be-forgotten Morical, and trotted home to luxury and sleep. Chapter 13. The Cocal. Next day, like the young muleteers of Granada, a good song which often haunted me in those days. With morning's earliest twinkle, again we are up and gone. With horses, 2 mules, and a negro and a coolie, carrying our scanty luggage in arima baskets. But not without an expression of pity from the negro who cleaned my boots. Where were we going? To the East Coast. Cuffy turned up what little nose he had. He plainly considered the East Coast, and indeed Trinidad itself, as not worth looking at. "Ah, you should go Barbados, sir. Dat the country to see. I Barbadian, see?" No doubt. It is very quaint, this self-satisfaction of the Barbadian Negro. Whether or not he belonged originally to some higher race, for there are as great differences of race among Negroes as among any white man. He looks down on the Negroes, and indeed on white men of other islands, as being of an inferior grade, and takes care to inform you in the first 5 minutes that he is neither crab nor Creole, but true Barbadian barn. This self-conceit of his, meanwhile, is apt to make him unruly, and the cause of unruliness in others when he emigrates. The Barbadian Negroes are, I believe, the only ones who give or ever have given any trouble in Trinidad, and in Barbados itself, though the agricultural Negroes work hard and well. Who that knows the West Indians knows not the insubordination of the Bridgetown boatman, among whose hands a traveller and his luggage are, it is said, likely enough to be pulled in pieces. However, they are rather more quiet just now, for not 1,000 years ago a certain steamer's captain, utterly unable to clear his quarter of the fleet of fighting, jabbering brown people, turned the steam pipe on them, at which, quite unexpected artillery, they fled precipitately, and have had some rational respect for a steamer's quarter ever since. After all, I do not deny that this man's being a Barbadian opened my heart to him at once, for old sake's sake. Another specimen of Negro character I was to have analysed, or tried to analyse, at the estate where I had slept. Monsieur F. had lately caught a black servant at the brookside busily washing something in a calabash, and asked him what he was doing there. The conversation would have been held, of course, in French, Spanish, African, Creole patois, a language which is becoming fixed with its own grammar and declensions, etc. A curious book on it has lately been published in Trinidad by Mr. Thomas, a coloured gentleman who seems to be at once no mean philologer and no mean humourist. The substance of the negro's answer was, "Why, sir, you sent me to the town to buy a packet of sugar and a packet of salt, and coming back it rained so hard the packets burst, and the salt was all washed into the sugar, and so I am washing it out again." This worthy was to have been brought to me, that I might discover, if possible, by what process of that which he was pleased to call his mind, he had arrived at the conclusion that such a thing could be done. Clearly, he could not plead unavoidable ignorance of the subject matter, as might the old cook at San Josef, who, the first time her master brought home Wenham Lake ice from Port of Spain, was scandalized at the dirtiness of the American water, washed off the sawdust, and dried the ice in the sun. His was a case of handy-andyism, as that intellectual disease may be named, after Mr. Lover's hero, like that of the Obeah woman when she tried to bribe the white gentleman with half a dozen of bottled beer, a case of muddle-headed craft and elaborate silliness, which keeps no proportion between the means and the end, so common in insane persons, frequent too among the lower Irish, such as Handy Andy, and very frequent, I am afraid, among the negroes. But, as might have been expected, the poor boy's moral sense had proved as shaky as his intellectual powers. He had just taken a fancy to some goods of his master's, and had retreated to enjoy them the more securely into the southern forests, with a couple of brown policemen on his track. So he was likely to undergo a more simple investigation than that which was submitted to by my analysis, viz., how he proposed to wash the salt out of the sugar. We arrived after a while at Valencia, a scattered hamlet in the woods with a good shop or store upon a village green, under the verandah whereof lay, side by side with bottled ale and biscuit tins, bags of carapo nuts, trapezoidal brown nuts enclosed originally in a round fruit, which ought some day to form a valuable article of export. Their bitter anthelminthic oil is said to have medicinal uses, but it will be still more useful for machinery, as it has, like that curious flat gourd, the sequa, the property of keeping iron from rust. The tree itself, common here in Guiana, is one of the true forest giants. We saw many a noble specimen of it in our rides. Its timber is tough, not over-heavy, and extensively used already in the island, while its bark is a febrifuge and tonic. In fact, it possesses all those qualities which makes its brethren, the Meliaceae, valuable throughout the tropics. But it is not the only tree of South America whose bark may be used as a substitute for quinine. They may be counted possibly by dozens. A glance at the excellent enumerations of the uses of vegetable products to be found in Linley's Vegetable Kingdom, a monument of learning, will show how God provides, how man neglects and wastes. As a single instance, the laurels alone are known already to contain several valuable febrifuges, among which the Demerara greenheart, or bibiri, claims perhaps the highest rank. Dr. McLagan has shown, says Dr. Lindley, that sulphate of bibiri acts with rapid and complete success in arresting ague. This tree spreads from Jamaica to the Spanish Main. It is plentiful in Trinidad, still more plentiful in Guyana. And yet all of it which reaches Europe is a little of its hard, beautiful wood, for the use of cabinet makers, while in Demerara, I am assured by an eye-witness, many tons of this precious green heart bark are thrown away year by year. So goes the world, and man meanwhile at once boasts of his civilization and complains of the niggardliness of nature. But if I once begin on this subject, I shall not know where to end. Our way lay now for miles along a path which justified all that I had fancied about the magnificent possibilities of landscape gardening in the tropics. A grass drive, as we should call it in England, a trace as it is called in the West Indies, some 60 feet in width and generally carpeted with short turf, led up hill and down dale, for the land, though low, is much ridged and gullied, and there has been as yet no time to cut down the hills, or to mettle the centre of the road. It led, as the land became richer, through a natural avenue even grander than those which I had already seen. The light and air entering the trace had called into life the undergrowth and lower boughs, till from the very turf to 150 feet in height rose one solid green wall, spangled here and there with flowers. Below was mamure, rosso, timit, arumas and tulumas, mixed with myrtles and melastomas, then the copper bois mulâtre, among the cocorite and yagua palms, among them the heads of enormous broad-leaved trees of I know not how many species, and the lianes festooning all from cope to base. The crimson masses of Norantia on the highest treetops were here most gorgeous, but we had to beware of staring aloft too long, for fear of riding into mud-holes, for the wet season would not end as yet, though dry weather was due, or even worse, into the great parasol ant warrens, which threatened, besides a heavy fall, stings innumerable. At one point, I recollect, a gold-green jacamar sat on a log and looked at me till I was within 5 yards of her. At another we heard the screams of parrots. At another the double note of the toucan. At another the metallic clank of the bell-bird, or what was said to be the bell-bird. But this note was not that solemn and sonorous toll of the Campanese of the mainland which is described by Waterton and others. It resembled rather the less poetical sound of a woman beating a saucepan to make a swarm of bees settle. At one point we met a gang of negroes felling timber to widen the road. Fresh fallen trees tied together with lianes lay everywhere. What a harvest for the botanist was among them! I longed to stay there a week to examine and collect. But time pressed, and indeed collecting plants in the wet season is a difficult and disappointing work. In an air saturated with moisture, specimens turned black and mouldy, and dropped to pieces, and unless turned over and exposed to every chance burst of sunshine, the labour of weeks is lost. If indeed meanwhile the ants and other creeping things have not eaten the whole into rags. Among these negroes was one who excited my astonishment, not merely for his size, though he was perhaps the tallest man whom I saw among the usually tall negroes of Trinidad, but for his features, which were altogether European of the highest type. The forehead high and broad, the cheekbones flat, the mask long and oval, and the nose aquiline and thin enough for any prince. Conscious of his own beauty and strength, he stood up among the rest as an old Macedonian might have stood up among the Egyptians he had conquered. We tried to find out his parentage. My companions presumed he was African, i.e., imported during the times of slavery. He said no, that he was a Creole, island-born, but his father, it appeared, had been in one of our Negro regiments and had been settled afterwards on a government grant of land. Whether his beauty was the result of atavism, of the reappearance under the black skin and woolly hair of some old stain of white blood, or whether, which is more probable, he came of some higher African race, one could not look at him without hopeful surmises as to the possible rise of the Negro, and as to the way in which it will come about, the only way in which any race has permanently risen, as far as I can ascertain, namely, by the appearance among them of sudden sports of nature, individuals of an altogether higher type, such as a man as the terrible Daga, whose story has been told. If I am any judge of physiognomy, such a man as that, having, what the Negro has not yet had, la carrière ouverte au talent, might raise not himself merely, but a whole tribe to an altogether new level in culture and ability. Just after passing this gang, we found, lying by the road, 2 large snakes, just killed, which I would gladly have preserved had it been possible. They were, the Negroes told us, dormilons, or mangrove cascabel, a species as yet, I believe, undescribed, and of course here considered as very poisonous, owing to their likeness to the true cascabel, whose deadly fangs are justly dreaded by the Lapo hunter. For the cascabel has a fancy for living in the Lapo's burrow, as does the rattlesnake in that of the prairie dog in the western United States, and in the same friendly and harmless fashion, and is apt, when dug out, to avenge himself on his host by a bite which is fatal in a few hours. But these did not seem to me to have the heads of poisonous snakes, and in spite of the entreaties of the terrified Negroes, I opened their mouths to judge for myself, and found them, as I expected, utterly fangless and harmless. I was not aware then that Dr. du Verteuil had stated the same fact in print, but I am glad to corroborate it, for the benefit at least of the rational people in Trinidad, for snakes, even poisonous ones, should be killed as seldom as possible. They feed on rats and vermin, and are the farmer's good friend, whether in the tropics or in England, and to kill a snake, or even an adder, who never bites anyone if he is allowed to run away, is, in 19 cases out of 20, mere wanton mischief. The way was beguiled, if I recollect rightly, for some miles on by stories about Cuba and Cuban slavery from one of our party. He described the political morality of Cuba as utterly dissolute, told stories of great sums of money voted for roads which are not made to this day, while the money had found its way into the pockets of government officials, and, on the whole, said enough to explain the determination of the Cubans to shake off Spanish misrule, and try what they could do for themselves on this earth. He described Cuban slavery as, on the whole, mild, corporal punishment being restricted by law to a few blows, and very seldom employed, but the mildness seemed dictated rather by self-interest than by humanity. "Ill use our slaves," said a Cuban to him. "We cannot afford it. You take good care of your 4-legged mules, we of our 2-legged ones." The children, it seems, are taken away from the mothers, not merely because the mothers are needed for work, but because they neglect their offspring so much that the children have more chance of living, and therefore of paying, if brought up by hand. So each estate has, or had, its crèche, as the French would call it, a great nursery in which the little black things are reared, kindly enough, by the elder ladies of the estate. To one old lady who wearied herself all day long in washing, doctoring, and cramming the babies, my friend expressed pity for all the trouble she took about her human brood. "Oh dear no," she answered. "They are a great deal easier to rear than chickens." The system, however, is nearly at an end. Already the Cuban Revolution has produced measures of half emancipation, and in 7 years' time probably there will not be a slave in Cuba. We waded stream after stream under the bamboo clumps, and in one of them we saw swimming a green riguaz, or whip snake, which must have been nearly 10 feet long. It swam with its head and the first 2 feet of its body curved aloft like a swan, while the rest of the body lay along the surface of the water in many curves, a most graceful object as it glided away into dark shadow along an oily pool. At last we reached an outlying camp belonging to one of our party who was superintending the making of new roads in that quarter, and there rested our weary limbs, some in hammock, some on the tables, some again on the clay floor. Here I saw, as I saw every 10 minutes, something new. That quaint vegetable plaything described by Humboldt and others, namely the spathe of the timid palm. It encloses, as in most palms, a branched spadix covered with innumerable rosebuds, most like a head of a millet, 2.5 feet long, but the spathe, instead of splitting and forming a hood over the flowers, as in the corcorite and most palms, remains entire and slips off like the finger of a glove. When slipped off, it is found to be made of 2 transverse layers of fibre, a bit of veritable natural lace, similar to, though far less delicate than, the famous lace bark of the legetta tree, peculiar, I believe, to one district in the Jamaica mountains. And as it is elastic and easily stretched, what hinders the brown child from pulling it out till it makes an admirable fool's cap, some 2 feet high and exactly the colour of his own skin, and dancing about therein, the fat oily little Cupidon, without a particle of clothing beside? And what wonder if we grown-up whites made fool's caps too, for children on the other side of the Atlantic, during which process we found what all said they had never seen before, that one of the spadices carried 2 caps, one inside the other, and one exactly like the other, a wanton superfluity of nature which I should like to hear explained by some morphologist. We rode away from that hospitable group of huts, whither we were to return in 2 or 3 days, and along the green trace once more. As we rode, M., the civilizer of Montserrat, and I, side by side, talking of Cuba and staring at the Norantias overhead, a dull sound was heard, as if the earth had opened, as indeed it had, engulfing in the mud the whole forehand of M's mule, and there he knelt, his beard outspread upon the clay, while the mule's visage looked patiently out from under his left arm. However, it was soft falling there. The mule was hauled out by main force. As for cleaning either her or the rider, that was not thought of in a country where they were sure to be as dirty as ever in an hour. And so we rode on, after taking a note of the spot, and, as it happened, forgetting it again, one of us at least. On again along the green trace, which rose to a ridge with charming glimpses of wooded hills and glens to right and left, past comfortable squatters' cottages, with cacao drying on sheets at the doors under sheds, with hedges of dwarf erythrina dotted with red jumby beads, and here and there that pretty climbing vetch, the overlook. I forget, by the by, to ask whether it is planted here, as in Jamaica, to keep off the evil eye, or overlook, whence its name. Nor can I guess what peculiarity about the plant can have first made the Negro fix on it as a fetish. The genesis of folly is as difficult to analyze as the genesis of most other things. All this while the dull thunder of the surf was growing louder and louder, till, not as in England over a bare down, but through thickest foliage down to the high tide mark, we rode out upon the shore and saw before us a right noble sight. A flat, sandy, surf-beaten shore, along which stretched, in one grand curve, lost at last in the haze of spray, 14 miles of cocoa palms. This was the Cocal, and it is worth coming all the way from England to see it alone. I at once felt the truth of my host's saying that if I went to the Cocal, I should find myself transported suddenly from the West Indies to the East. Just such must be the shore of a coral island in the Pacific. These cocos, be it understood, are probably not indigenous. They spread, it is said, from an East Indian vessel which was wrecked here. Be that as it may, they have thoroughly naturalized themselves. Every nut which falls and lies throws out, during the wet season, its roots into the sand, and is ready to take the place of its parent when the old tree dies down. About 30 to 50 feet is the average height of these cocoa palms, which have all, without exception, a peculiarity which I have noticed to a less degree in another sand and shore-growing tree, the pinaster of the French Landes. They never spring upright from the ground. The butt curves, indeed lies almost horizontal in some cases, for the lowest 2 or 3 yards, and the whole stem up to the top is inclined to lean. It matters not toward which quarter, for they lean as often toward the wind as from it, crossing each other very gracefully. I am not mechanician enough to say how this curve of the stem increases their security amid loose sands and furious winds, but that it does so I can hardly doubt, when I see a similar habit in the pinaster. Another peculiarity was noteworthy, their innumerable roots, long, fleshy, about the thickness of a large string, piercing the sand in every direction, and running down to high tide mark, apparently enjoying the salt water, and often piercing through bivalve shells, which remained strung upon the roots. Have they a fondness for carbonate of lime as well as for salt? The most remarkable and, to me, unexpected peculiarity of cocal is one which I am not aware whether any writer has mentioned, namely, the prevalence of that amber hue which we remarked in the very first specimens seen at St. Thomas's. But this is certainly the mark which distinguishes the cocoa palm, not merely from the cold dark green of the palm east or the silvery grey of the jaguar, but from any other tree which I have ever seen. When inside the cocal, the air is full of this amber light. Gradually, the eye analyzes the cause of it, and finds it to be the resultant of many other hues from bright vermilion to bright green. Above, the latticed light which breaks between and over the innumerable leaflets of the fruit fronds comes down in warmest green. It passes not over merely, but through the semi-transparent straw and amber of the older leaves. It falls on yellow spadices and flowers, and rich brown spathes, and on great bunches of green nuts, to acquire from them more yellow yet. For each fruit stalk and each flower scale at the base of the nut is veined and tipped with bright orange. It pours down the stems, semi-grey on one side, then yellow, and then, on the opposite side, covered with a powdery lichen, varying in colour from orange up to clear vermilion, and spreads itself over a floor of yellow sand and brown fallen nuts, and the only vegetation of which, in general, is a long crawling echeitis with pairs of large cream-white flowers. Thus, the transparent shade is flooded with gold. One looks out through it at the checker work of blue sky, all the more intense from its contrast, or at a long whirl of white surf and grey spray, or turning the eyes inland toward the lagoon, at dark masses of mangrove above which rise, black and awful, the dying ballatas, stag-headed, blasted, tottering to their fall, and all as through an atmosphere of Rhine wine, or from the inside of a topaz. We rode along mile after mile, wondering at many things. First, the innumerable dry fruits of timid palm, which lay everywhere, mostly single, some double, a few treble from coalition, I suppose, of the 3 carpels which every female palm flower ought to have, but of which it usually develops only 1. They may have been brought down the lagoon from inland by floods, but the common belief is that most of them come from the Orinoco itself, as do also the mighty logs which lie about the beach in every stage of wear and tear, and which, as fast as they are cut up and carried away, are replaced by fresh ones. Some of these trees may actually come from the mainland, and drifting into this curving bay be driven on shore by the incessant trade wind. But I suspect that many of them are the produce of the island itself, and more, that they have grown, some of them, on the very spot where they now lie, for there are, I think, evidences of subsidence going on along this coast. Inside the Kokal, 200 yards to the westward, stretches inland a labyrinth of lagoons and mangrove swamps, impassable to most creatures save alligators and boa constrictors. But amid this labyrinth grow everywhere mighty trees, ballatas in plenty among them, at every stage of decay, dying seemingly by gradual submergence of their roots, and giving a ghastly and ragged appearance to the forest. At the mouth of the little river Nariva, a few miles down, is proof positive, unless I am much mistaken, of similar subsidence. For there I found trees of all sizes, roseau scrub among them, standing rooted below high tide mark, and killed where they grew. So we rode on, stopping now and then to pick up shells, chip-chips, which are said to be excellent eating, a beautiful purple bivalve, to which in almost every case a coralline had attached itself on a form quite new to me, a lash some 18 inches long, single or forked. Purplish as long as its coat of lime, holding the polyps, still remained, but when that was rubbed off, a mere round strip of dark horn, and in most cases flexible and elastic, so that it can be coiled up and tied in knots. A very curious and graceful piece of nature's workmanship. Among them were curious flat cake urchins, with oval holes punched in them, so brittle that, in spite of all our care, they resolved themselves into the loose sand of which they had been originally compact, and I could therefore verify neither their genus nor their species. These were all, if I recollect, that we found that day. The next day we came on hundreds of a most beautiful bivalve, their purple colour quite fresh, their long spines often quite uninjured. Some change of the sandy bottom had unearthed a whole warren of the lovely things, and mixed with chip-chips innumerable, and with a great bivalve with a thin wing along the anterior line of the shell, they strewed the shore for a quarter of a mile or more. We came at last to a little river, or rather tideway, leading from the lagoon to the sea, which goes by the name of Doubloon River. Some adventurous Spaniard, the story goes, contracted to make a cutting which would let off the lagoon water in time of flood for the sum of 1 doubloon, some £3.5. Spent 6 times the money on it, and found his cutting, when once the sea had entered, enlarge into a roaring tideway, dangerous, often impassable, and eating away the cocoa rapidly towards the south. Mother Earth, in this case at least, having known her own business better than the Spaniard. How we took off our saddles, sat down on the sand, hallooed, waited. How a black policeman, whose house was just being carried away by the sea, appeared at last with a canoe. How we and our baggage got over one by one in the hollow log without, by seeming miracle, being swept out to sea or upset. How some horses would swim and others would not. How the negroes held on by the horses till they all went head over ears under the surf. And how at last, breathless with laughter and anxiety for our scanty wardrobes, we scrambled ashore one by one into prickly roseau, resaddled our horses in an atmosphere of long thorns, and then cut our way and theirs out through scrub into the cocoa. All this should not be written in these pages, but drawn for the benefit of Punch by him who drew the egg-stealing frog, whose pencil I longed for again and again amid the delightful mishaps of those forest rambles, in all of which I never heard a single grumble, or saw temper lost for a moment. We should have been rather more serious, though, than we were, had we been aware that the river god or presiding Jumbie of the doubloon was probably watching us the whole time, with the intention of eating anyone whom he could catch, and only kept in wholesome awe by our noise and splashing. At last, after the sun had gone down, and it was ill picking our way among logs and ground creepers, we were aware of lights, and soon found ourselves again in civilization, and that of no mean kind. A large and comfortable house, only just rebuilt after a fire, stood among the palm trees, between the sea and the lagoon, and behind it the barns, sheds, and engine houses of the cocoa works, and inside it a hearty welcome from a most agreeable German gentleman and his German engineer. A lady's hand, I'm sorry to say the lady was not at home, was evident enough in the arrangements of the central room. Pretty things, a piano and good books, especially Longfellow and Tennyson, told of a cultivation and taste in that remotest wilderness. The material hospitality was what it always was in the West Indies, and we sat up long into the night around the open door, while the surf roared and the palm trees sighed, and the fireflies twinkled, talking of dear old Germany and German unity, and the possibility of many things which have since proved themselves unexpectedly most possible. I went to bed and to somewhat intermittent sleep. First, my comrades going to bed romping like English schoolboys, and not in the least like the effeminate and luxurious Creoles who figure in the English imagination, broke a 4-post bedstead down among them with hideous roar and ruin, and had to be picked up and called to order by their elders. Next, the wind, which ranged freely through the open roof, blew my bedclothes off. Then the dogs exploded outside, probably at some hen roost robbing a possum, and had a chevy through the cocoas till they'd treed their game and bayed it into their heart's content. Then something else exploded, and I do not deny it set me more aghast than I had been for many a day. Exploded, I say, under the window, with a shriek of hut-tut-tut-tut-tut-tut-tut, such as I hope never to hear again. After which, dead silence, save of the surf to the east and the toads to the west. I fell asleep wondering what animal could own so detestable a voice, and in half an hour was awoke again by another explosion, after which, happily, the thing, I suppose, went its wicked way, for I heard it no more. I found out the next morning that the obnoxious bird was not an owl, but a large goat-sucker, a Nycteribius, I believe, who goes by the name of Jumbie Bird among the English negroes, and no wonder, for most ghostly and horrible is his cry. But worse, he has but one eye, and a glance from that glaring eye, as from the basilisk of old, is certain death. And worse still, he can turn off its light as a policeman does his lantern, and become instantly invisible. Opinions which, if verified by experiment, are not always found to be in accordance with facts. But that is no reason why they should not be believed. In St. Vincent, for instance, the negroes one evening rushed shrieking out of the boiling house. "Oh, Massa Robert, we all killed. Da one great Jumbie bird come in a hole atop of roof. Oh, Massa Robert, you no go in. You killed, we killed," etc., etc. Massa Robert went in and could see no bird. "Ah, Massa Robert, him darky, him eye, but him see you all the time. You killed, we killed," etc. da capo. Massa Robert was not killed, but lives still to the great benefit of his fellow creatures, negroes especially. Nevertheless, the negroes held to their opinion. He might, could, or would, or should have been killed, and was not that clear proof that they were right? After this, who can deny that the negro is a man and a brother, possessing the same reasoning faculties and exercising them in exactly the same way as 3 out of 4 white persons? But if the night was disturbed, pleasant was the waking next morning, pleasant the surprise at finding that the whistling and howling air bath of the night had not given one a severe cold, or any cold at all. Pleasant to slip on flannel shirt and trousers, shoes and stockings were needless, and hurried down through a stampede of kicking, squealing mules who were being watered ere their day's work began, under the palms to the sea. Pleasant to bathe in warm surf, into which the Four Eyes squatted in shoals as one ran down, and the moment they saw one safe in the water, ran up with the next wave to lie staring at the sky. Pleasant to sit and read one's book upon a log, and listen to the soft rush of the breeze in the palm leaves, and look at a sunrise of green and gold, pink and orange, and away over the great ocean, and to recollect, with a feeling of mingled nearness and loneliness, that there once nothing save that watery void between oneself and England, and all that England held. And then, when driven into breakfast by the morning shower, to begin a new day of seeing and seeing and seeing, certain that one would learn more in it than in a whole week of book reading at home. We spent the next morning in inspecting the works. We watched the negroes splitting the coconuts with a single blow of that all-useful cutlass, which they handle with surprising dexterity and force, throwing the thick husk on one side, the fruit on the other. We saw the husk carded out by machinery into its component fibres, for cocoa rope matting, coir rope, saddle stuffing, brushes, and a dozen other uses, while the fruit was crushed down for the sake of its oil, and could but wish all success to an industry which would be most profitable, both to the projectors and to the island itself, were it not for the uncertainty, rather than the scarcity of, labour. Almost everything is done, of course, by piecework. The negro has the price of his labour almost at his own command, and when, by working really hard and well for a while, he has earned a little money, he throws up his job and goes off, careless whether the whole works stand still or not. However, all prosperity to the cocoa works of Messrs. Ulrich and Gerold, and may the day come soon when the English of Trinidad, like the Ceylonese and the Dutch of Java, shall count by millions the cocoa palms which they have planted along their shores, and by thousands of pounds the profit which accrues from them. After breakfast, call it luncheon rather, we started for the lagoon. We had set our hearts on seeing manatees, sea cows, which are still not uncommon on the east coast of the island, though they have been exterminated through the rest of the West Indies since the days of Père Labat. That good missionary speaks of them in his delightful journal as already rare in the year 1695. And now, as far as I am aware, none are to be found north of Trinidad and the Spanish Main, save a few round Cuba and Jamaica. We were anxious, too, to see, if not to get, a boa constrictor of one kind or another, for there are two kinds in the island, which may be seen alive at the Zoological Garden in the same cage. The true boa, which is here called mahajuel, is striped as well as spotted with two patterns, one over the other. The huilia, anaconda, or water boa, bears only a few large round spots. Both are fond of water, the huilia living almost entirely in it. Both grow to a very large size, and both are dangerous, at least to children and small animals. That there were huilias about the place, possibly within 50 yards of the house, there was no doubt. One of our party had seen with his own eyes one of 27 feet long killed, with a whole kid inside it, only a few miles off. The brown policeman crossing an arm of the Guanapo only a month or two before had been frightened by meeting one in the ford, which his excited imagination magnified so much that its head was on the one bank while its tail was on the other, a measurement which must, I think, be divided at least by 3. But in the very spot in which we stood, some 4 years since, happened what might have been a painful tragedy. 4 young ladies, whose names were mentioned to me, preferred, not wisely, a bathe in the still lagoon to one in the surf outside, and as they disported themselves, one of them felt herself seized from behind. Fancying that one of her sisters was playing tricks, she called out to her to let her alone, and looking up, saw to her astonishment her 3 sisters sitting on the bank and herself alone. She looked back and shrieked for help, and only just in time, for the huilia had her. The other 3 girls, to their honour, dashed in to her assistance. The brute had luckily got hold not of her poor little body, but of her bathing dress, and held on stupidly. The girls pulled. The bathing dress, which was, luckily, of thin cotton, was torn off. The huilia slid back again with it in his mouth into the dark labyrinth of the mangrove roots, and the girl was saved. 2 minutes' delay and his coils would have been round her, and all would have been over. The sudden daring of these lazy and stupid animals is very great. Their brain seems to act like that of the alligator or the pike, paroxysmally, and by rare fits and starts, after lying for hours motionless as if in sleep. But when excited, they will attempt great deeds. Dr. de Vauteuil tells a story, and if he tells it, it must be believed, of some hunters who wounded a deer. The deer ran for the stream down a bank, but the hunters had no sooner heard it splash into the water than they heard it scream. They leapt down to the place and found it in the coils of a huilia, which they killed with the deer. and yet this snake, which had dared to seize a full-grown deer, could have had no hope of eating her, for it was only 7 feet long. We set out down a foul, porter-coloured creek, which soon opened out into a river, reminding us, in spite of all differences, of certain alder and willow-fringed reaches of the Thames. But here the wood which hid the margin was altogether of mangrove, the common rhizophorus, or black mangroves, being of course the most abundant. Over them, however, rose the statelier avicennias, or white mangroves, to a height of 50 or 60 feet, and poured down from their upper branches whole streams of air roots, which waved and creaked dolefully in the breeze overhead. But on the water was no breeze at all. The lagoon was still as glass, and the sun was sickening, and we were glad to put up our umbrellas and look out from under them for manatees and boas. But the manatees usually only came in at night, to put their heads out of water and browse on the lowest mangrove leaves, and the boas hid themselves so cunningly, either altogether under water or with only the head above, that we might have passed 6 without seeing them. The only chance indeed of coming across them is when they are travelling from lagoon to lagoon, or basking on the mud at low tide. So all the game which we saw was a lovely white egret, its back covered with those stiff pinnated plumes which young ladies, when they can obtain them, are only too happy to wear in their hats. He, after being civil enough to wait on a bough till one of us got a sitting shot at him, heard the cap snap, thought it as well not to wait until a fresh one was put on, and flapped away. He need not have troubled himself. The negroes, but too apt to forget something or other, had forgotten to bring a spare supply, and the gun was useless. As we descended, the left bank of the river was entirely occupied with cocoas, and the contrast between them and the mangroves on the right was made all the more striking by the afternoon sun, which, as it sank behind the forest, left the mangrove wall in black shadow, while it bathed the palm groves opposite with yellow light. In one of these palm groves we landed, for we were right thirsty, and to drink lagoon water would be to drink cholera or fever. But there was plenty of pure water in the cocoa trees, and we soon had our fill. A negro walked, not climbed, up a stem like a 4-footed animal, his legs and arms straight, his feet pressed flat against it, and his hands clinging round it. A feat impossible, as far as I have seen, to an European. Tossed us down plenty of green nuts, and our feast began. 2 or 3 blows with the cutlass at the small end of the nut cut off not only the pith coat, but the point of the shell, and disclose, the nut being held carefully upright meanwhile, a cavity full of perfectly clear water, slightly sweet and so cold, the pith-coat being a good non-conductor of heat, that you are advised, for fear of cholera, to flavour it with a little brandy. After draining this natural cup, you are presented with a natural spoon of rind, green outside and white within, and told to scoop out and eat the cream which lines the inside of the shell, a very delicious food in the opinion of Creole. After which, if you are as curious as some of us were, you will sit down under the amber shade and examine at leisure the construction and germination of those famous and royal nuts. Let me explain it, even at the risk of prolixity. The coat of white pith outside with its green skin will gradually develop and harden into that brown fibre of which matting is made. The clear water inside will gradually harden into that sweetmeat which little boys eat off stalls and barrows in the street. The first delicate deposit of which is the cream in the green nut. This is albumen, intended to nourish the young plant till it has grown leaves enough to feed on the air, and roots enough to feed on the soil, and the birth of that young palm is in itself a mystery and a miracle, well worth considering. Much has been written on it, of which I, unfortunately, have read very little, but I can at least tell what I have seen with my own eyes. If you search among the cream layer at the larger end of the nut, you will find gradually separating itself from the mass a little white lump like the stalk of a very young mushroom. This is the ovule. In that lies the life, the forma formativa of the future tree. How that life works according to its kind, who can tell? What it does is this. It is locked up inside a hard, woody shell, and outside that shell are several inches of tough, tangled fibre. How can it get out as soft and seemingly helpless as a baby's finger? All know that there are 3 eyes in the monkey's face, as the children call it, at the butt of the nut. 2 of these eyes are blind and filled up with hard wood. They are rudiments, hints that the nut ought to have, perhaps had uncounted ages since, not 1 ovule but 3, the type number in palms. 1 ovule alone is left, and that is opposite the 1 eye which is less blind than the rest, the eye which a schoolboy feels for with his knife when he wants to get out the milk. As the nut lies upon the sand in shade and rain and heat, that baby's finger begins boring its way with unerring aim out of the weakest eye. Soft itself, yet with immense wedging power, from the gradual accretion of tiny cells, it pierces the wood and then rends right and left the tough fibrous coat. Just so may be seen, I have seen, a large flagstone lifted in a night by a crop of tiny soft toadstools which have suddenly blossomed up underneath it. The baby's finger protrudes at last and curves upward toward the light to commence the campaign of life. But it has meanwhile established, like a good strategist, a safe base of operations in its rear, from which it intends to draw supplies. Into the albuminous cream which lines the shell, and into the cavity where the milk once was, it throws out white fibrous vessels, which eat up the albumen for it, and at last line the whole inside of the shell with a white pith. The albumen gives its food wherewith to grow, upward and downward. Upward, the white plumule hardens into what would be a stem. The 1 white cotyledon which sheathes it develops into a flat, ribbed, forked green leaf, sheathing it still, and above it fresh leaves, sheathing always at their bases, begin to form a tiny crown and assume each, more and more, the pinnate form of the usual cocoa leaf. But long ere this, from the butt of the white plumule, just outside the nut, white threads of root have struck down into the sand, and so the nut lies, chained to the ground by a bridge-like cord, which drains its albumen through the monkey's eye into the young plant. After a while, a few months I believe, the draining of the nut is complete, the cord dries up, I know not how, for I had neither microscope nor time wherewith to examine, and the parts and the little plant, having got all it can out of its poor wet nurse, casts her ungratefully off to wither on the sand, while it grows up into a stately tree, which will begin to bear fruit in 6 or 7 years, and thenceforth continue, flowering and fruiting the whole year round without a pause, for 60 years or more. I think I have described this, to me, miraculum simply enough to be understood by the non-scientific reader, if only he or she have first learned the undoubted fact, known I find to very few educated English people, that the cocoa palm, which produces coir rope and coconuts and 100 other useful things, is not the same plant as the cacao bush, which produces chocolate, nor anything like it. I am sorry to have to insist upon this fact, but till Professor Huxley's dream and mine is fulfilled, and our schools deign to teach, in the intervals of Latin and Greek, some slight knowledge of this planet, and of those of its productions which are most commonly in use, even this fact may need to be restated more than once. We re-embarked again and rowed down the river mouth to pick up shells and drink in the rich, roaring trade breeze after the choking atmosphere of the lagoon, and then rowed up home, tired and infinitely amused, though neither manatee nor boa constrictor had been seen, and then we fell to siesta, during which Mr. Tennyson's forgiveness, I read myself to sleep with one of his best poems, and then went to dinner, not without a little anxiety. For M, the civilizer of Montserrat, had gone off early with mule, cutlass, and haversack, back over the doubloon and into the wilds of Manzanilla, to settle certain disputed squatter claims, and otherwise enforce the law. And now the night had fallen away, and he was not yet home. However, he rode up at last, dead beat, with a strong touch of his old swamp fever, and having had an adventure which had like to have proved his last. For as he rode through the doubloon at low tide in the morning, he espied in the surf that river god, or Jumbie, of which I spoke just now, namely the grey back fin of a shark. And his mule espied it too, and laid back her ears, knowing well what it was. M rode close up to the brute. He seemed full 7 feet long, and eyed him surlily, disinclined to move off. So they parted, and M went on his way. But his business detained him longer than he expected. When he got back to the river mouth it was quite dark, and the tide was full high. He must either sleep on the sands, which with fever upon him he would not have been over safe, or try the passage. So he stripped, swam the mule over, tied her up, and then went back up to his shoulders in surf, and cutlass in hand too, for that same shark might be within 2 yards of him. But on his second journey he had to pile on his head first his saddle, and then his clothes and other goods, few indeed, but enough to require both hands to steady them, and so walked helpless through the surf, expecting every moment to be accosted by a set of teeth, from which he would hardly have escaped with life. To have faced such a danger alone and in the dark, and thoroughly well aware as an experienced man of its extremity, was good proof, if any had been needed, of the indomitable Scots courage of the man. Nevertheless, he said, he never felt so cold down his back as he did during that last wade. By God's blessing, the shark was not there, or did not see him, and he got safe home, thankful for dinner and quinine. Going back the next morning at low tide, we kept a good lookout for M's shark, spreading out, walkers and riders, in hopes of surrounding him and cutting him up. There were 6 weapons among us, of which my heavy bowie knife was not the worst, and we should have given good account of him had we met him, and got between him and the deep water. But our valour was superfluous. The enemy was nowhere to be seen, and we rowed on, looking back wistfully but in vain for a grey fin among the ripples. So we rode back along the Cocal and along that wonderful green glade, where I, staring at Narantius in tree-tops instead of at the ground beneath my horse's feet, had the pleasure of being swallowed up, my horse's hindquarters at least, in the very same slough which had engulfed M's mule 3 days before, and got a roll in much soft mud. Then up to camp, where we expected breakfast, not with greediness, though we had been nigh 6 hours in the saddle, but with curiosity, for he had promised to send out the hunters for all game that could be found and give us a true forest meal, and we were curious to taste what lapo, cuenco, guatsupita deer, and other strange meats might be like. Nay, some of us agreed that if the hunters had but brought in a tender young red monkey, we would surely eat him too, if it were but to say that we had done it. But the hunters had no luck. They had brought in only a padjui, an excellent game bird, an anteater, and a great cachicami, or 9-banded armadillo. The anteater the foolish fellows had eaten themselves. I would have given them what they asked for his skeleton, but the armadillo was cut up and hashed for us, and was eaten to the last scrap, being about the best game I ever tasted. I fear he is a foul feeder at times, who by no means confines himself to roots or even worms. If what I was told be true, there is but too much probability for Captain Mayne Reid's statement that he will eat his way into the soft parts of a dead horse and stay there until he has eaten his way out again. But, to do him justice, I never heard him accused, like the giant armadillo of the Main, of digging dead bodies out of their graves, as he is doing in a very clever drawing in Mr. Wood's Homes Without Hands. Be that as it may, the armadillo, whatever he feeds on, has the power of transmuting it into most delicate and wholesome flesh. Meanwhile, and hereby hangs a tale, I was interested not merely in the armadillo, but in the excellent taste with which it and everything else was cooked in a little open shed over a few stones and fire sticks, and complimenting my host thereon, I found that he had there in the primeval forest an admirable French cook, to whom I begged to be introduced at once. Poor fellow, a little lithe Parisian, not 30 years old, he had got thither by a wild road. Cook to some good bourgeois family in Paris, he had fallen in love with his master's daughter, and she with him, and when their love was hopeless and discovered, the two young foolish things, not having, as is too common in France, the fear of God before their eyes, could think of no better resource than to shut themselves up with a pan of lighted charcoal, and so go they knew not whither. The poor girl went, and was found dead, but the boy recovered and was punished with 20 years of Cayenne, and here he was now, on a sort of ticket of leave, cooking for his livelihood. I talked a while with him, cheered him with some compliments about the Parisians, and so forth, dear to the Frenchman's heart. What else was there to say? And so left him not without the fancy that, if he had had but such an education as the middle classes in Paris have not, there were the makings of a man in that keen eye, large jaw, sharp chin. The very fellow, said someone, to have been a first-rate zouave. Well, perhaps he was a better man, even as he was, than as a zouave. And so we rode away again, and through Valencia, and through San Josef, weary and happy, back to Port of Spain. I would gladly, had I been able, have gone farther due westward into the forests, which hide the river Orapuche, that I might have visited the scene of a certain 2 years' idyll, which was enacted in them some 40 years and more ago. In 1827, cacao fell to so low a price, $2 per hundredweight, that it was no longer worth cultivating, and the head of the F family, leaving his slaves to live at ease on his estates, retreated, with a household of 12 persons, to a small property of his own, which was buried in the primeval forests of Orapuche. With them went his second son, Monseigneur F., then and afterwards curé of San Josef, who died shortly before my visit to the island. I always heard him spoken of as a gentleman and a scholar, a saintly and cultivated priest of the old French school, respected and beloved by men of all denominations. His church of San Josef, though still unfinished, had been taxed, as well as all the Roman Catholic churches of the island, to build the Roman Catholic cathedral at Port of Spain, and he, refusing to obey an order which he considered unjust, threw up his curé and retreated with the rest of the family to the palm-leaf ajupas of the forest. Monsieur F. chose 3 of his finest negroes as companions. Melchior was to go out every day to shoot wild pigeons, coming every morning to ask how many were needed, so as not to squander powder and shot. The number ordered were always punctually brought in, besides sometimes a wild turkey, pajui, or other fine birds. Alejos, who is now a cacao proprietor and owner of a house in Arima, was chosen to go out every day, except Sundays, with the dogs, and scarcely ever failed to bring in a lap or cuenco. Aristobal was chosen for the fishing, and brought in good loads of river fish, some 16 pounds in weight, and thus the little party of cultivated gentlemen and ladies were able to live, though in poverty, yet sumptuously. The bishop had given Monseigneur F. permission to perform service on any of his father's estates, so a little chapel was built. The family and servants attended every Sunday, and many days in the week, and the country folk from great distances found their way through the woods to hear Mass in the palm-thatched sanctuary of El Reposo. So did that happy family live the gentle life for some 2 years, till cacao rose again in price. The tax on the churches was taken off, and the F's returned again to the world, but not to civilization and Christianity. Those they had carried with them into the wilderness, and those they brought back with them unstained. Chapter 14. The Education Question in Trinidad. When I arrived in Trinidad, the little island was somewhat excited about changes in the system of education, which ended in a compromise like that at home, though starting from almost the opposite point. Among the many good deeds which Lord Harris did for the colony was the establishment throughout it of secular elementary ward schools, helped by government grants, on a system which had, I think, but 2 defects. First, that attendance was not compulsory, and next, that it was too advanced for the state of society in the island. In an ideal system, secular and religious education ought, I believe, to be strictly separate and given as far as possible by different classes of men. The first is the business of scientific men and their pupils, the second of the clergy and their pupils, and the less either invades the domain of the other, the better for the community. But, like all ideals, it requires not only first-rate workmen, but first-rate material to work on. An intelligent and high-minded populace who can and will think for themselves upon religious questions, and who have, moreover, a thirst for truth and knowledge of every kind. With such a populace, secular and religious education can be safely parted. But can they be safely parted in the case of a populace either degraded or still savage, given up to the lusts of the flesh, with no desire for improvement and ignorant of that moral ideal, without the influence of which, as my friend Professor Huxley well says, there can be no true education? It is well if such a people can be made to submit to one system of education. Is it wise to try to burden them with two at once? But if one system is to give way to the other, which is the more important, to teach them the elements of reading, writing, and arithmetic, or the elements of duty and morals? And how these latter can be taught without religion is a problem as yet unsolved. So argued some of the Protestant and the whole of the Roman Catholic clergy of Trinidad, and withdrew their support from the government schools to such an extent that at least 3/4 of the children, I understand, went to no school at all. The Roman Catholic clergy had, certainly, much to urge on their own behalf. The great majority of the coloured population of the island, besides a large proportion of the white, belonging to their creed. Their influence was the chief, I had almost said the only, civilizing and Christianizing influence at work on the lower orders of their own coloured people. They knew none so well how much the Negro required, not merely to be instructed, but to be reclaimed from gross and ruinous vices. It was not a question in Port of Spain, any more than it is in Martinique, of whether the Negroes should be able to read and write, but of whether they should exist on the earth at all for a few generations longer. I say this openly and deliberately, and clergymen and police magistrates know but too well what I mean. The priesthood were and are doing their best to save the Negro, and they naturally wished to do their work on behalf of society and of the colony in their own way, and to subordinate all teaching to that of religion, which includes with them morality and decency. They therefore opposed the government schools, because they tended, it was thought, to withdraw the Negro from his priest's influence. I am not likely, I presume, to be suspected of any leaning towards Romanism, but I think a Roman Catholic priest would have a right to a fair and respectful hearing if he said, "You have set these people free without letting them go through the intermediate stage of feudalism, by which, and by which alone, the white races of Europe were educated into true freedom. I do not blame you. You could do no otherwise. But will you hinder their passing through that process of religious education under a priesthood by which, and by which alone, the white races of Europe were educated up to something like obedience, virtue, and purity? These last, you know, we teach in the interest of the state, as well as of the Negro. And if we should ask the state for aid in order that we may teach them, over and above a little reading and writing, which will not be taught save by us, for we only shall be listened to, are we asking too much, or anything which the state will not be wise in granting us? We can have no temptation to abuse our power for political purposes. It would not suit us to put the matter on its lowest ground, to become demagogues. For our congregations include persons of every rank and occupation, and therefore it is our interest as much as that of the British government that all classes should be loyal, peaceable, and wealthy. As for our peculiar creed, with its vivid appeals to the senses, Is it not a question whether the utterly unimaginative and illogical Negro can be taught the facts of Christianity, or indeed any religion at all, save through his senses? Is it not a question whether we do not, on the whole, give him a juster and clearer notion of the very truths which you hold in common with us than an average Protestant missionary does? Your Church of England, it must be understood that the relations between the Anglican and the Romish clergy in Trinidad are, as far as I have seen, friendly and tolerant, does good work among its coloured members. But it does so by speaking, as we speak, with authority. It, too, finds it prudent to keep up in its services somewhat at least of that dignity, even pomp, which is as necessary for the Negro as it was for the half-savage European of the early Middle Age, if he is to be raised above his mere natural dread of spells, witches, and other harmful powers, to somewhat of admiration and reverence. As for the merely dogmatic teaching of the dissenters, we do not believe that the mere Negro really comprehends one of those propositions, whether true or false, Catholic or Calvinist, which have been elaborated by the intellect and the emotion of races who have gone through a training unknown to the Negro. With all respect for those who disseminate such books, we think that the Negro can no more conceive the true meaning of an average dissenting hymn book than a Sclavonian of the German marches 1,000 years ago could have conceived the meaning of St. Augustine's Confessions. For what we see is this, that when the personal influence of the white missionary is withdrawn, and the Negro left to perpetuate his sect on democratic principles, his creed merely feeds his inordinate natural vanity with the notion that everybody who differs from him is going to hell, while he is going to heaven, whatever his morals may be. If a Roman Catholic priest should say all this, he would at least have a right, I believe, to a respectful hearing. Nay, more, if he were to say, "You are afraid of our having too much to do with the education of the Negro, because we use the confessional as an instrument of education." Now, how far the confession is needful or useful or prudent in a highly civilized and generally virtuous community may be an open matter. But in spite of all your English dislike of it, hear our side of the question, as far as Negroes and races in a similar condition are concerned. Do you know why and how the confessional arose? Have you looked, for instance, into the old middle-aged penitentials? If so, you must be aware that it rose in an age of coarseness which seems now inconceivable. In those barbarous times when the lower classes of Europe, slaves or serfs, especially in remote country districts,